Welcome. Today we're talking about world building. The last time I did one of these it was about characters and dialogue. So if you're new to the channel and you're interested in that, go and check that out later as well. What I'm going to do here is sort of a guide to the sorts of things that people generally think about when they're doing this kind of stuff for video games and for other types of games like tabletop role-playing games and stuff like that as well. So 5 categories of things to think about in relation to your game world. And as is often the case, whenever you get a numbered list, you know, we're here on YouTube, we love a numbered list. Numbered list. But numbered lists are a really nice way of breaking down information to make it more appealing or easier to access. But what you tend to find is stuff that's in a numbered list is not as separate as the way it's being represented, right? So you separate stuff out into a list and you say, here's 5 things. And then as soon as you start really paying any attention to those 5 things, you see that they're not really separate, they're all interlinked. And so what we're going to do is move through these things independent of each other and then try and think of them as more interrelated afterward. The 5 things I would encourage anyone to think about when they're thinking about world building for a game or any fictional setting are the history, the politics of the world, the culture of the world, the economy of the world, and the geography. The only one of these things that isn't defined by humans, but it defines a lot of these things. The degree to which each of these elements is relevant in your game is going to depend on the game you're making, where it's set, and all sorts of considerations like the type of game it is. If you made a game about rats who live in a sewer, we might get a glimpse into what their rat economy is like because all of the money is cheese or something like that. And the fact that it's in a sewer tells us something about the geography. It tells us that this is under a human settlement or something like that. But not every game is going to have every one of these elements in. And I think that's an important thing to start with. But you can often get some really neat ideas by thinking through these elements and trying to join them together, which is what we're going to be doing over the next couple of slides. First off, thinking if your game is set in the real world, then where are you going to find out about the topic of your game? So a few years ago, I was working on a board game. It was like an area control game like Risk, and it was based on graffiti culture in New York. I'm kind of showing you this to show that whenever I've made a game that is about something in the real world, it sort of takes me down this research rabbit hole of like, oh, I'm gonna watch the Star Wars documentary. I'm gonna read this Graffiti Kings book, because you find out stuff about the game world and you'll often find out things that can actually inform your game mechanics as well. When I was doing this research, I'm looking at this kind of subculture that existed for New York graffiti artists, and I'm thinking like, what did these people value and how do I turn that into points in the game? And a lot of the time, if you see something like this and you're interested in sci-fi or fantasy, you'll think, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't make games set in the real world. But the thing I would sort of encourage you to think of is that all science fiction or fantasy has something that roots it in the real world, whether we're aware of it or not. So this is Carlos Sanchez Esquerra. This is the artist, or one of the artists who was responsible for Judge Dredd and what Judge Dredd looked like. Judge Dredd is from a British comic, and it was like a dystopian view of what the future of America would be like. And he's an anti-hero, right? He's meant to be a fascist. He's meant to not be a great guy. Carlos grew up in Franco's Spain, and that is why when we've got this kind of futuristic fascist cop, we've got all of these eagles and stuff all over him, right? So this is an example of that kind of seepage. It's impossible to make any sort of fantasy or science fiction where you're not drawing some sort of influence from the real world in some way, whether it's in the architecture of your world or the way people speak or their food or whatever. There'll always be something that comes through. So you may as well do it in a conscious way, and that means even if you're not making a game like this where you're trying to like model a real historical place, there is a value in looking at things in the real world, because then you can sort of go, oh, we want him to symbolize this thing. What symbolizes that in the real world? And you can bring across symbols that your players or your readers will recognize. This is kind of a general point as well. You know, as indies, we're usually out to make the weirdest thing we possibly can, because why the hell not? But then I'm sure there are some indie developers as well where you're much more sort of happy to just make a generic Goblin Forest game or something like that. And I would say usually, if what you're aiming for is commercial success of some sort, then it's all about this balance of the familiar with what's novel. The sweet spot in design is always going for the most outlandish thing that the largest amount of people will accept. So you want something that has some amount of novelty to it, but if it's completely novel, if it's completely new, they won't understand it, it will blow their minds and they'll just get freaked out by it, right? So generally speaking, if you're trying to make something as a commercial product, you're aiming for that balance. So if you can do that, it's blah, 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 but then you're usually in a safe sort of area. So in Arcanum, you have a Tolkien-esque world with elves and orcs and everything, but it is going through it's just been through its industrial revolution. So you have a sort of mix of steampunk and traditional high fantasy elements. Dragon Age as an IP is another example of this. There are so many things in Dragon Age where you see them and you think, well, that's a thing that I've seen in Lord of the Rings, or that's a thing that I've seen in Elder Scrolls or whatever, but it has its twists on those things, right? It is a generic fantasy world where everyone hates the elves, the mages are feared and kind of locked up, and a bunch of people are French for some reason as well. It's this, again, balancing of the familiar and the novel. When you think of the history of the world of your game, we often think of this bottom one, large events which define a country or the whole world. Yeah? So in our world, things like World War II, things like 9/11, these are big sort of epoch defining events that change people's lives on a mass level. But then we also have local history. What is it about the town you live in that makes it that town? What is the economic history? Already starting to overlap the categories because you can't talk about history without economics. But Night in the Woods is a really good game about this because it is not really about the small town, but these characters are products of the town that they come from. Do you go back to where you came from because of the familiarity of the people there, or does it kind of suck there because of the town changing, because of jobs going and stuff like that? So whenever you think about history, think about the level of the history that you're looking at. How kind of zoomed in is it to a local thing? And it doesn't always have to be the big, broad, long-term history of the world. It can be like micro local history that you care about. And this can be a better way to hook players into the stuff that the characters care about. Because if something happened long ago in the story of your world, but none of the characters in the world care about it, then why should the player? And then when you think of history, you can think of these kind of questions like, what is and isn't taught about history? If you think of a traditional RPG where you're going around picking up fragments and books and stuff, and they're just telling you the history, that is not as interesting as having the idea of a repressed history where some things are openly told to people and some things are kept secret. I mean, Heaven's Vault is a game that is all about this, right? Mechanically speaking, it is a game about translating a dead language and learning a dead language. But thematically, it's all about this idea of suppressed histories and incomplete histories. And what about history do characters disagree on? And how does this inform their individual politics? So the idea of history just being a set of things that happened, it's not a realistic idea, right? We know in the real world that history is this kind of political story, and different people tell different versions of history because it kind of suits them and how they see the present world or how they want the present world to be. And the idea of like a fictional game having this very strict, this is what happened and this is what happened, but it doesn't create interesting conflicts in the same way as having an incomplete history. Because if we can have characters in our game world that disagree on history, that's great. That creates conflict, and it creates, if it's like a game where the player can choose sides, it creates like a whole thing to interact with there at the level of interactive narrative. But then if we just have a narrator come in and say, and actually, this person was right about history all the time, that takes away all the uncertainty, which is what makes it interesting and fun to engage with. The reason why fans enjoy engaging with that so much is exactly because it is incomplete. And if you think of things like the FromSoft fandom, where everyone is trying to piece together the lore from all these fragments, If the law was complete in the game, they wouldn't be able to do that, right? And they're only able to do that by the fact that it's all kind of scrappy and spread out in the way that it is. Economy is not just about money. It's about what resources exist in the world and who are the haves and the have-nots and how is that enforced or normalized. Remember, we use money as a stand-in for other types of thing, but, you know, who has money is often a factor that is determined by a bunch of other things, like who has access to natural resources and stuff like that. This is a weird overlap with sort of game design or UX design, because we just often go, oh, it's a game, you should have coins, right? And maybe you should have coins because people immediately know what a coin does. But there are various points in history where the primary resource hasn't been gold coins. It's been other things. I remember the most disappointing thing I ever learnt about pirates is that the most valuable thing by weight that pirates would have usually had on their ship would have been spices. So the idea of like a pirate having a ship full of gold coins is just not a thing. And there have been times in history where, you know, Roman soldiers were paid with salt and stuff like that. So the idea of like what's being valuable always being boiled down to coins, it's got a good reason because we immediately know what a coin is for in a game, but it can be the sort of thing you can play around with to make your world more interesting. And then the other thing I'd encourage you to think about are non-physical resources. So concepts like popularity or street cred. And again, this is where economy starts to overlap with culture, because this isn't a currency really, but in the context of your game, it could be a currency. It could be something that you get in exchange and stuff like that. When you think about politics, what type of government is there? This is sort of capital P politics, right? So how is the world that your characters exist in ruled? Who gets to make decisions and rules and stuff like that? And we have games that are politics through and through, even if you're not acting as a politician. So Papers, Please is a good example of this. If you've never played Papers, Please, you play a border control person and you're sort of responsible for checking people's documents. And this is interesting because I think you get newspapers that tell you about the world changing around you and stuff, but a lot of it comes through in just the gameplay of like legislation changing about what type of people are allowed to go through and stuff like that. So yeah, again, politics doesn't always have to be the big version. It's the same point that I was making about history, right? Politics can sometimes be small p politics. So when we think of terms like office politics or gender politics, this is like everyday politics. Like, how do we police norms? What sort of things are people encouraged or discouraged to do? And how does that power operate? These are all the sorts of things you can think about. And particularly if you've got a small setting that this kind of big P politics doesn't figure into it, then the kind of smaller stuff of like how do people interact and how does power work on a day-to-day basis could be way more important. And if you think of things like The Walking Dead, like any sort of post-apocalyptic thing where people are negotiating how their new community is going to work, that's an example of sort of small P politics, which is gradually building up into becoming big P politics again, right? Geography, lovely, lovely world map from Death Howl. What kind of physical environment are we in and how does this affect things? What's the geology like? What's in their hills? What's the weather like? There are all sorts of cultural things that can be impacted by this sort of stuff, right? Think of the ancient Egyptians and their obsession with the Nile as being like the life-giving force of their country, because it was, right? They had a desert country and everything was built around the Nile, so all of their kind of religious imagery and stuff comes up around the Nile. Think of something like, I don't know if anyone else is familiar with Tibetan sky burial, where in parts of Tibet, when you die, you are fed to the birds. And that has a particular spiritual meaning, but it also has a practical meaning because you can't bury bodies in a snowy, cold place because they deteriorate really, really slowly. That is an example of the culture and the religion being informed by the geography of what it's like to live up at the top of a cold mountain that's frozen a lot of the time. Now, when I was at school, we had geography as in thinking about the land, and then we had human geography, which is stuff like this? Like, how have people moved around over time? What is a country? If you have countries in your world, how do people draw their maps? There's a whole politics around that, like who gets to be in the middle of the map. What have people decided to call places and why? Like, are places named after natural things in the environment? Are places named after people or types of people? The town where I live in England is one of the first places where the Vikings came. So there are loads of towns in my road that are named after Viking stuff. That is an example of like human geography rippling through sort of centuries of culture. Rainworld is a strange game, isn't it? Because you see stuff like these mechanisms and stuff that appears to be man-made. It's a structure, isn't it? It's something that was built by someone. And we recognize that because we see that it's square and angular. But it's so old. Like this one, you can see the edges have weathered, right? And this is all giving the impression of a place that's not supposed to be just inhabited by animals. And yet when we play Rainworld, that's what we see. We play a character as an animal, everything else is animals, right? So that's already doing a really interesting thing in terms of the, I'm going to say human geography, but we don't really know. When you think of culture, what does culture even mean? It's kind of everything that people do that animals don't do. You can think of things like, how diverse is the culture in your game? Is it all one group of people? Or are you representing diverse groups of people? Are there insiders and outsiders? And one of the sort of arguments against having a more diverse group of characters in a game is that each one ends up standing in for like a whole group. If you make a game like a Dwarf Fortress game that is just about dwarves, you can tell a story about how diverse dwarves are in their own group. But if you make a fantasy world where there's like a dwarf, an elf, a hobbit, and one of everything, everyone becomes a stand-in for their group, right? So there are pros and cons. Sometimes the specificity of like focusing on one group of people can be good because it can give the individual members of that more individuality and more kind of personhood, I guess. How does the culture that exists in your world normalize or oppose the political or economic situation? I'll give you an example of this from this game. Now, the thing that's very interesting about Through the Darkest of Times is basically in Germany, there are loads of rules about how you can depict Nazi Germany or what things you can depict, right? And when this game was made, they actually were allowed to do certain things that other games hadn't been allowed to. So one of the things that you'll notice if you play Through the Darkest of Times, which is a very depressing game, when you meet random Germans and you're just sort of talking to characters, they say Heil Hitler as an everyday greeting, right? If you think of like what that means for a culture's psychology, Hitler wasn't just like their leader. It was almost like treated like you would say good day or God be with you or something like that. For the name of your leader to be used as an everyday greeting, like God save the king or something like that, that must be really impactful on a culture and on the psychology of the people in that culture, right? So that's an example of something where they wanted in this game to depict what it was really like to live in this time period. So stuff like that was really important. And that's an example of like the culture, right? The everyday way that people speak, like their greetings and stuff. How does that normalize politics and economics and stuff like that, right? If you have a ruler like Hitler and you use their name as a greeting, that says something about the relationship between the everyday culture of how people speak to each other and the political situation. You've already seen that it's really hard to talk about any of these 5 things without interrelating them. They're very hard to separate out from each other. Numbered list, numbered list, numbered list, numbered list. And the other thing I would encourage you to think about when you're world building, because so far a lot of what I've talked about has been about believability. We know from all the other things that we enjoy, like for example SpongeBob SquarePants and Kafka, that believability is not always the goal of a creative work, right? And sometimes we can get to like a different kind of reality by making things that are unusual or unbelievable, which is exactly what Franz Kafka does in things like Metamorphosis. We've got an allegory, and it's supposed to feel weird. It's supposed to feel dreamlike. And if that's what you're going for, then that's fine. You might not need everything in your world to tie together in this totally believable way. I think it's just important to understand what you're going for out of these things, right? Is what you're making supposed to be believable? Is it allowed to be surreal or absurd in some way? And maybe you want it to be believable in some ways and realistic in some ways and absurd in others. Or it might be that what you're making is idealistic or utopian, which is what cozy games are, right? You could look at a cozy game and say, well, that wouldn't happen. Everyone in a town wouldn't be friends. And it's like, well, no, but that's the central fantasy that is appealing to the person who's playing this. And now I dare you all to make a cozy game of Kafka. Bugtown. A cozy game about some bugs that are scared that they might turn into humans. This is my big soapbox before we move on to a practical activity you can do and then some thoughts on environmental storytelling. So I think as someone who is a creative and not just a consumer, you should think more about the history of the place you're making and less about lore. Lore is sort of the idea that there is a definite correct version of events that happened in your game world, right? And if we think less in terms of lore and more in terms of history, we get kind of much richer results generally in terms of stuff for the player to think about, stuff for the characters to care about. If there's a lore in your world that this happened and this happened because the great evil dragon did this, blah, 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 and everyone knows that and believes the same thing about it, then you don't have an interesting source of tension in your world. You don't have an interesting things for players to debate and stuff like that. And one of the things that players get a lot of pleasure from, or fans in general get a lot of pleasure from, is taking an incomplete history in a game or any sort of IP and trying to turn it into lore. So you don't need it to be lore in the first place. You need it to be ambiguous on some level, or to have some ambiguity about it, because taking that ambiguity and trying to massage it out into something that makes sense is actually what a lot of people get out of engaging with things like RPG worlds, big fantasy IPs and stuff like that. They want there to be some unanswered questions so that they can kind of slot their own interpretation in. I want to give a shout out to Mages and Murder Dads, which is a really good podcast about CRPGs. They started on Baldur's Gate and then they played through a bunch of different CRPGs and they ended up on Disco Elysium, which is what this background art is for. When they played Disco Elysium, they kind of relate it a lot to this Frederick Jameson quote, which is an amazing quote. So this is Jameson explaining what history means. And he says, "History is what hurts. It's what refuses desire and sets inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis," right? So what that means is history is anything that decides what you can and can't do. If something that happened in the past does not impact people and restrict them in some way, then it's not history, it's just something that happened. An apple falls off a tree 10 miles away, no one sees it, no one cares, no one eats the apple. That's just an event, right? History would be the tree falls over and smashes someone's house and now their life is ruined. You don't need all of this quote. You don't need to get all of this quote to get what it's getting at. History is what hurts. And I think the distinction between history and lore, this quote is really helpful for thinking about that, because history is what sort of determines the state that the current world is in terms of like what people can do and what they can't do, whereas lore is just kind of a list of facts about the world that you learn because they're interesting, right? This is quite interesting for fans, but for making a compelling story where we care about the characters and the characters have interesting conflicts with each other, we kind of have to think of history in this way. History is what shapes the world into a kind of shape that favors certain people and makes other people like struggle more. This is kind of what Disco Elysium is all about. Like every person that you meet in Disco Elysium is a person that is dealing with the history of the world and the position that they've been put in by it, right? No one's just popped into existence and been like, hey, I'm a cabbage farmer, I'm having a lovely time. Everyone in that world is sort of a person that has kind of been forced into a situation by history. So in the battle of lore versus history, lore is kind of an approach where we assume that a true account of what actually happened is a possibility. And there are certain types of setting, like a very cute fantasy setting, where that might be appropriate, where that level of simplicity might be okay, because we're not dealing with something that's trying to be socially realistic or anything like that. Lore often comes down to this kind of fan service to the idea of there being like an authoritative version of events of what really happened. Goblin Department put it perfectly in the chat now. History is why that you connect to the world as a person, whereas lore is just an encyclopedia. Exactly. And if you provide fans with the lore, then the problem is now whenever they interact with a character who has a relationship to history, they're going to know what the right answer was. So if you've got your elves and your dwarves who are arguing about the history of elves and dwarves, and you tell the player, well, actually, the dwarves are right in this situation, then you've just spoiled the whole tension of that thing, because it's very easy to pick a side and it stops being a dilemma, right? If you have questions about history where there's no clear right answer, then you have a dilemma, because the player has no way of knowing if the side they're taking is absolutely true. And that's a compelling conflict for players to make decisions around, maybe not even to make decisions around in the game, just to think about outside of the game. As soon as you tell them, you've ruined that whole thing for them. The kind of historical approach to writing a game world history, we have our best guess at what happened in a time, in a place, and people can change that best guess by presenting new evidence. That's kind of how history works. When we treat history this way, then we can get story conflict out of it. Story conflict which arises from different interpretations of the world, and the audience doesn't know which one of those is right. Now, again, a lot of this comes down to like, how complex or simple do you want your world to be? And if you've got a Star Wars situation where it's like, we're the good guy rebels, they're the evil empire, then you can probably present two versions of history where it's very clear which one the player is supposed to agree with, right? But if you want the player to actively engage with this history and interpret it and get fun out of interpreting it, then you need to leave some stuff open, and you need to leave there, opportunity for there to be some sort of dilemma of interpretation there. And the classic linking of politics to history and how we tell historical stories. Now you can attribute this quote to George Orwell or to Zach de la Rocha. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So we've been trying to separate out these 5 elements of world building. But this quote from 1984 is sort of indicating, right, if you control the present moment's media and the way that stories are told in the present moment, you control people's perception of what happened in the past. If I can tell people a particular story about the past, then I can shape their ideology about how the world should be, right? And this is kind of, our country used to be this way, and we should go back to that. And obviously, in those kind of cases, when people say those sorts of things, which I'm not saying, I'm sort of paraphrasing, those people are often generating a particular view of the past that never existed, right? And we see this all the time in reactionary approaches to media as well, like when people get upset that a historical setting has particular ethnicities in that they think weren't supposed to exist in it, and so on. They are upset about it because they have a particular view of how they want the present and future to be. The past is used as a rhetorical thing within present culture to try and enact politics that change the present and the future, that kind of thing. This is why we need people like poets and storytellers, because they can say something in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 words that takes me 3 minutes to say. And then I think this is like the final point I have on this in terms of like broadly thinking about the history of a world and how it's shaped. But one of the things that's helpful to think about as well is why now? Like, why is your game set in this specific point of the timeline? It should never be just because, right? There should be a particular reason why the current moment in time is why we bring the player in. This can help to orient the player in the world. It can be, this thing is about to happen and you are the chosen one. It can be that kind of cheesy stuff. It could be because some big global event is happening, like your equivalent of World War II. But there should always be a reason why you've picked that particular time. Okay, here is an exercise you can do in relation to your own games and your own world building that I've called the Worldbuilder's pentagram. And the thing that's good about a pentagram as a shape is that every point can get to every other point. And the idea here is to write these down. You don't need to actually make the pentagram. You just need to place these things like at a pentacle type shape. So you've got these arranged around in a 5. Your history, politics, culture, economy, geography. And then the idea is that you pick some of these connections and you just try and write a single statement that links these things together, right? You will quickly find it's impossible to do every single connection. But the point of this exercise is to get you to think about the relationships between these things. You know, if you were to mix geography and economy in a particular historical setting, you'd end up with something about the Spice Road and how important the Spice Road was because of spices only growing in one part of the world and people in another part of the world getting them. It would be almost impossible to do this and still end up with something legible at the end of it. But I'm pretty sure if you just do like 3 or 4 of these connections for your game world, you will maybe end up with some interesting stuff. Any of these sorts of exercises that you get given in a kind of creative class are usually about doing that. They're usually about just trying to help you see what your blind spots are. Because again, if you're thinking in that kind of TV tropes, lore, geek mode, you might have thought of your history as purely a series of events and not thought about how your history impacts the current politics of the world, right? How does stuff that happened long ago in time actually change how, you know, power works in your world or change the culture that we currently have? And you could, again, the more you know about the real world and how these things work in the real world, the more you can start to map them onto your world. So in English, or in kind of English-speaking countries, we have a really weird set of historical things that lead to certain parts of our culture, like the names of our months and the names of our days of the week, right? So we've got a bunch of names of months that come from Roman rulers, like October and July. And then we have days of the week where Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at least are from Norse gods, right? And these are all historical elements of who invaded English-speaking countries at different points in time, right? But they feed into our culture of like, what are our days called? What are our months called? All of that kind of stuff. So the point of this exercise is really just to sit with all of these 5 things for a little while and to think about how they interrelate. And like someone asked right at the start of this, what if my game doesn't have one of these things? What if my game doesn't focus on one of these things? That's fine. Not every game is going to have like a deep exploration of every one of these things. But if it does have at least 3 of these things, you can start to think about how they interrelate. And that's going to give you some ideas for your storytelling, which is what we're focused on today. But it might also give you some ideas for your gameplay, right? You might come up with a new character class by thinking about the relations between these things, right? Because when we start to think about economies, we start to think about the types of jobs people have. I don't know, maybe in a dark fantasy world that's full of undead, we get lots of new types of job based on that because of the different kinds of pest control and stuff you have to do in a fantasy world.
Numbered list, 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 numbered list. For some reason people prefer when information has been arranged in numbered sequence. Helps them to know how much has been and what is still coming. Numbered list, numbered list, numbered list is a numbered list. But learning something to a higher level generally requires synthesis of the pieces I have just separated out to try and make a numbered list. Numbered list, numbered list, numbered list, numbered list,